Our next talk in the new work in the Theory of Mind graduate conference here at the University of Bucharest is Nimra Asif. And Nimra is coming from the University of Connecticut. And her talk today is titled Minimal Theory of Mind and Pushmi-pullyu Representations. Nimra, thanks for being here. We can already see the slides.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So please take it away, and very much looking forward.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. So today I'm going to be talking about minimal theory of mind and Pushmi-pullyu representations. So the first part of the talk will basically be an explanation of what Pushmi-pullyu representations, or PPRs for short, are. I'll explain some special features of PPRs, and then in the second half, I'll focus on I'll argue that PPRs can be used to articulate a minimal theory of mind account, which is a middle ground between mind reading and behavior reading. So to start, can everyone see the slides? Yes.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So Pushmi-pullyu representations were first articulated by Ruth Millikan in 1995, and they were articulated as part of her theory of mental representation, teleosemantics. So I won't be focusing on teleosemantics today, but just these representations themselves. So Pushmi-pullyu representations, PPRs for short, are non-conjunctive representations that have a descriptive and directive function at the same time. So they at once give information about the world and instruct the organism what to do. So consider the following example of bee dances. I'm just going to play a video. Is it? So the bee dances, for example, can be described as PPR. So I'm not saying that they are PPRs. We would need empirical evidence to really make a strong conclusion about that, but they can be described as PPRs because the bee dances are giving these other bees information about the location of the nectar, and then at the same time, basically telling these bees to go retrieve the nectar. So when they get information that the nectar is located 90 degrees to left or 60 degrees to the right, they fly in that direction. So this is basically the important part of a PPR. They have these two functions. They're providing information and directing action, and they do it without being conjunctive representation. So they don't have to be combined together like these other representations that I'll describe briefly. So just to give another idea, you could think of beaver splashes. So when beavers hear a splash in the water, they automatically dive underwater. So they're representing this, again, might be a PPR because they're representing the danger in their environment and then immediately responding to it. And another example is clams. So when they detect chemicals from crabs feeding on other clams, they just burrow down to deeper depths. And this, again, there's a descriptive information in the environment, and then they're responding to it with a very specific action. So, and to emphasize, PPRs are non-conjunctive representations, and they're supposed to contrast with representations that are purely descriptive, that only describe the world, and representations that are purely directive. They only tell you what to do. So in these representations, the representer or the animal or human that's using them, in order to use them to result in action, they have to combine them with other representations. For example, consider beliefs that we have about the world. So a belief that you have about the location of a particular object in your room, you can't, it won't, that could be used for any number of activities. And in order to use it for a very specific activity, in order to do something specifically, you need to combine it with a directive representation. So you need to combine it with a goal in order to result in action. And the same applies to directive representations. You usually need to combine them. You need to use some process of practical inference, combine it with another representation to get action. You need to use representations of goals with what's happening in the world to result in action. And that's not necessary with PPRs. So on Millikan's view, PPRs are not only these more primitive representations in animals, humans also have them. So consider the example of Gibsonian affordances. So on Millikan's framework, Gibsonian affordances are probably the most important kinds of PPRs because we're constantly using them. So here the affordances are basically aspects of the environment that afford the possibility of various activities. So they're basically opportunities for action. And the idea here is that the perceiving or grasping an affordance in the environment involves knowing how to let your current perception of your surroundings guide your actions. So what you see in the environment immediately dictates what you're doing. So there's this unmediated link between perception and action. For example, consider the boy in the picture catching a ball. So Millikan writes, you perceive how to catch the ball by understanding how to let your perception of it guide your movements such that the catching will be achieved. Your moment by moment perception of where the ball is in the air, how fast and in what direction it is moving is a descriptive representation. It is true or false, correct or incorrect. At the same time, given that you intend to catch the ball, it functions as a directive representation, directing the changing positions of your eyes, head, hands, and feet in that way needed to catch something that is moving in just that way over there. So the idea is that the boy's perception of the exact location of the ball, the speed at which it's moving, and the direction it's moving at each moment guides his body so he can catch the ball. And Gibsonian affordances are, according to Millikan, the most important types of PPRs because we use them when we're interacting with the environment, when we're moving around, when we're doing anything. And all these examples are to illustrate the special character of PPR. So PPRs are basically representations that serve to potentiate actions or ways of being guided by perceived conditions towards certain ends. So the information that you're receiving from the environment immediately guides your actions without any inference or any reflection needed. So you don't need to engage in this process of combining representations together to engage in forms of action. The hallmark feature of PPRs is the existence of a direct link between perception and action, which is unmediated by inference, insofar as the descriptive information in the PPR is immediately linked to action or something specific that should be done. And this is, as I explained earlier, this is not the case with purely descriptive and purely directive representation. So in order to use them, you do need a process of practical inference. And now I want to move on to the second part. So I think PPRs can play an important role in moving the debate about whether non-human animals and infants can understand other minds forward. So before I get into that, I'm just going to give some background for the theory of mind debate. So as I'm sure many of you know, theory of mind is defined in the literature as this ability to attribute mental states to others to predict or understand their behavior, explain their behavior usually. And in their foundational paper on theory of mind, Premack and Woodruff first raised the question of whether non-human animals such as apes understand the minds of others. And in their paper, they defined theory of mind as the attribution of mental states. They explain a system of inferences of this kind is properly viewed as a theory because such states are not directly observable. They must be inferred from behavior, and then they can be used to make predictions about the behaviors of others. So their initial study with the chimp named Sarah led to a whole cottage industry of research with non-human animals and children. So the standard test, as many of you know, is the stiff false belief task, the Sally-Ann task, and that usually, when it's presented, requires the participants to predict the behavior of a character by attributing a false belief to the character. And the findings, at least very systematically, of these standard tests were that children younger than 4 can't pass them, and non-human animals don't do very well on these tests either. But then more recently, there were non-standard theory of mind tests that use behavioral responses and spontaneous reactions like looking time to see if non-human animals and children younger than 4 understand other minds. And they did find positive findings. So one of the first studies was the Inoshi and Beller-Jones study with very young infants. And then there were many follow-ups to that. And the studies with animals are, some of the most famous ones are the hare and the Pena study. And since these studies have found positive results, there's been an intense debate about how to interpret them, which can roughly be divided into, or at least I will focus on these 2 main camps, the mind reading and the behavior reading camp. So in the mind reading camp, the researchers argue that these findings, these positive findings of these studies, do suggest that the infants and the non-human animals understand mental states. So they suggest that they have a theory of mind. And here it seems like what they mean by theory of mind is the standard view, which requires understanding that others have mental states, inferring these mental states from their behavior, and then representing them as such. So which requires meta representation. So to have mental representations of others as mental representations, and then using these states to make predictions or form explanations of others as behaviors. And then there's the behavior reading camp. So in the behavior reading camp, these researchers argue that all these positive results are unconvincing. They think the behavior of infants and non-human animals in these studies could easily be explained using a simple predictive strategy, which they label behavior reading. So it would just involve prediction and anticipation of others' behavior based on simple rules, such as people will look for an object where they last encountered it, or any associations you've formed based on experience about behavior. And the position that I'll be focusing on today is the minimal theory of mind, which is put forth by certain researchers that argue that these are 2 extremes and there should be a middle ground between mind reading and behavior reading. So sure, infants are not doing what adults do. They're not making inferences, and they don't have a theory of other minds, but they're doing more than just forming associations between behaviors. They understand something about other minds. They call this implicit or minimal theory of mind. And the motivation here is to give a form of mind reading that those with limited cognitive resources could use, such as infants and non-human animals. And there are some accounts in the literature already of minimal theory of mind, namely Butterfield and Epperle's famous account. I think these accounts are not successful because they still remain too wedded to the standard framework of mind reading, but I will not focus on that today. I can talk about it in the Q&A if anybody is interested. Instead, I'm going to talk about my own account. So I think it's possible to give an account of minimal theory of mind that isn't too cognitively demanding. So it's this more basic form of mind reading that uses PPRs, or representations of affordances. So on this account of minimal mind reading, what the non-human animals and infants would have is practical knowledge of mental states that would allow them to directly recognize mental states for the specific purpose of immediate practical action or for dealing with them. So they would represent mental states and respond to them using PPRs, which have both the descriptive and directive function in a single representation, which provides information about another agent's mental state, and then instructs the organism, whoever the minimal mind reader is, what they should do about it. So on this account, the basic mind readers wouldn't have any concepts of mental states. They wouldn't have a theory. and they wouldn't engage in any inferential processes about mental states or represent them as such. So they wouldn't represent them as propositional attitudes, which is in contrast to the standard views of mind reading. So on this account, the function of mind reading would not be to predict or explain or even make sense of or explicitly predict the behavior of other agents. Rather, the function of mind reading is to guide the mind reader's own behavior relative to other social agents in their environment. So the minimal mind reader is sensitive to others' minds and mental states because they do matter to her, right? So the minimal mind reader, whether it's an infant, has to live around their parents. So, and animals have to live around other animals. So the other people, others' minds do matter to them, but it's a very practical concern. It's limited to knowing how to deal with them when they have to, or how to respond to their mental states. And the process of mind reading on this account is also very different from the standard view. It's perceptual rather than inferential, because mental states on this view are not seen as hidden or unobservable states that need to be inferred from observable behavior. Instead, mental states can be observed directly, just like we can perceive concrete things in the world or abstract perceptual objects. The important Millicanian idea here is that perception consists in non-inferential recognition of affordances, which, as I explained earlier, are aspects of the environment that afford the possibility of various actions to the perceiving animals. So perception consists in the recognition of abstract patterns that guide action. So minimal mind readers on this account would recognize mental states as affording possibilities of action. They would treat them as affordances, but they would still represent mental states. So the traditional assumption is that to represent mental states, you need to have a propositional attitude, such as Sally knows that the toy is in the yellow box, or Sam knows that Sally hid his toy, which requires having meta representation. So you need to represent the mental representations of others, and you need to have some understanding of what mental states are. So you need to know what it means that for Sally to know something or Sam to know something, and then what that means for their actions. So how is this this mental state, going to guide their actions or behavior? But on this account, the animals can represent mental states through affording knowledge. So the assumption that you need to represent mental states as propositional attitudes is being rejected. Instead, the minimal mind reader would not represent mental states as factic inner representations of others, and would not assign these mental states to others as mental properties. There's no attribution. They're just representing them using practical knowledge. And this basically consists in recognizing the mental states. So they need to have the ability to recognize mental states as the same stuff again in the world. So there it is again, and then deal with it. That's all that they need to know. All right. So I'm going to try to illustrate this with some examples because it's very abstract at the moment. So consider the example of dogs engaging in play behavior. So there's usually a dog that comes up to the other dog and they engage in this type of play bout. And I'll play this video. So once the dogs, they come up to each other and they engage, they automatically start tugging and moving around and jumping at each other and hitting. So it's this immediate reaction to something. And I think if you apply the account I just gave to this example, the the basic idea would be that the dog can perceive the playful state of another dog by just looking at it. So during this perceptual process, the information about the mental state of playfulness that's carried by abstract patterns and sensory data will be turned or translated into inner intentional signs. It would be translated into PPRs or representations of affordances without the dog engaging in any inferential process or having any understanding of any conceptual understanding, at the least, of the state of playfulness. The descriptive side of the PPR would represent the state that they're perceiving, the playfulness, and the directive side would guide their behavior. It would instruct them to engage in this playful behavior with the other dog. So, and if you like switch this example a little bit, let's say the other dog is actually in a state of anger or aggression, then the dog is going to respond very differently. So there, the dog is picking up on very different patterns. It's picking up on a very different mental state, anger, and it would respond with very different behaviors, such as running away or barking at the other dog. And the main idea here is that there's this direct connection, direct link. So as soon as the dog perceives the mental state, the dog responds to it. That's all that's going on here. It's perception and action, at least on my account. And another example is consider a child that's able to somehow recognize a particular mood that their father sometimes gets into. Now, we can say a lot of things about this mood. It could be a mood that the father gets into when he has a really bad meeting with his boss and he's just very frustrated and irritated about everything. The child does not know any of these things or understand them, but the child can still deal with this mood. So it would be similar things to the dog case. So the child can recognize this mood and then respond to it. The descriptive side would represent the particular mood, and the directive side would guide the child's behavior. So maybe the child would avoid the dad or just not engage as much with the dad on days when the dad is in this particular mood. And here again, there's a direct connection between perceiving the mental states of others and responding to them without engaging in inferential processes or understanding anything conceptual about those states. So I think this form of mind reading using PPRs can be a helpful middle ground between the standard mind reading interpretation and the behavior reading interpretation. If we attribute this form of mind reading to non-human animals and infants, we don't have to credit them with the complex social cognitive abilities that the standard mind reading interpretation does, such as having a theory of other minds, understanding the properties of mental states, inferring mental states from behavior or other processes, and then attributing those mental states to others to explain or predict their behavior. We just all we're doing is saying that they have this practical knowledge of mental states that is limited to knowing how to recognize them and as the same thing in the world again and deal with them. So it's this capacity to recognize mental states and respond to them. But I think at the same time, we're crediting, if we apply this form of mind reading to infants and non-human animals, we're crediting them with more than just a simple predictive strategy that requires knowing associations between behaviors, because these minimal mind readers would have knowledge of mental states. It would just be practical knowledge. They wouldn't have any conceptual understanding of mental state. They would have this know-how, how to deal with them. And they would also be representing mental states. So they don't represent them as propositional attitudes, but they represent them using PPRs or representations of affordances. I also think this account can be helpful. So I explained earlier that there's this discrepancy between the standard theory of mind tests and the non-standard theory of mind tests. So the general finding is that non-human animals and infants just do better on non-standard theory of mind tests. And I think this account can be used to explain this discrepancy. So consider the following two studies. So they're both by Buttleman and colleagues. The first one, the 2009 one, is with infants, and the second one is with apes. But both studies use the same setup. So in these studies, the researchers use an interactive task, which doesn't require the infants or the animals to predict behavior. It just requires them to respond to the behavior. So it's a helping task in which the infant or the ape has to help the experimenter retrieve an object. They have to help the experimenter find a toy, basically. And successfully helping the experimenter requires the infants and the apes to take into consideration the mental states, the beliefs of the experimenter. So I'll briefly explain the setup of this study. So there's in both of the studies, there was a true belief condition and a false belief condition. And in both conditions, infants or the apes watched an experimenter. This is a second experimenter, not the one they're helping, take a toy from the box that it was already in and put it in another box. And then the other experimenter, the one that the children or the apes have to help, is either watching this switch, which is the true belief condition, or not watching it. So in the false belief condition, the experimenter that they have to help does not observe this condition. And all of this is observed by the apes and the non-human animals, the non-human animals, which is, I think, apes in the study, and the children. So they're watching as this happens. And then in the test trial, the experimenter comes back in and he tries to open the box that the toy was originally in, the one he put it in, and is basically really struggling. So he's really trying to open the box and he's pretending to really, really struggle with it, can't open it. And then they ask the kids and the apes to help the experimenter. So the prediction here is that, or the expectation is, in the true belief condition, if they understand the beliefs, if they take into account the beliefs of the experimenter, the children or the apes are expected to help the experimenter open the empty box in the true condition, the one that the toy is no longer in, because he was there for the switch. So he saw that the switch happened. He must not be after the toy. But in the false belief condition, where the experimenter didn't observe the switch, they're expected to open the other box, the one that the toy is actually in, because the experimenter didn't observe the switch and must be looking for the toy. And the researchers found that the helping behavior of the children was consistent with these predictions. So the infants helped the experimenter open the empty box in the true belief condition and then open the box with the toy in the false belief condition. The results with the apes were slightly more, they were slightly different. So they did open the other box in the false belief condition, but in the true belief condition, they were more inconsistent. Sometimes they would open one box, sometimes they would open another. So it wasn't conclusive, but the researchers did conclude that they at least have some understanding, some basic understanding of false belief. And the test is not, there's a lot of problems with the test, and like you can raise objections to other interpretations being open here. But the idea here is that this test, along with other tests, have still found positive results. So there have been similar results found with non-human animals and infants in spontaneous reaction tasks, so where they use their looking time to determine if they understand the beliefs of others. And the idea here is that these results can be interpreted using the account I put forth. So on the minimal theory of mind account I just explained, the infants and non-human animals in these studies can represent and respond to the beliefs of others using representations of affordances. So since these non-standard tests don't require the infants and the non-human animals to make explicit predictions or provide explanations of others' behavior by attributing mental states to them as the standard tests do, it's easier for them to pass these tests. in these tests, they just have to react to or respond to the mental states of others, which they can do by using their basic and practical knowledge of mental states. So this account has some possible utility for understanding and explaining the behavior of non-human animals and infants in these empirical studies. And I think it can be a good middle ground between mind reading and behavior reading. So I think that's all I have. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to your questions.
All right, terrific. I'm sure everybody's joined me in thanking you for your work.
Thank you. I will stop share.
And
or should I keep my presentation up?
Well, let's see what questions you get and if they connect with
Sure.
Yeah, great.
Thank you.
We have a question from the room. Elizabeth, could you come on up here? And yeah, great. Thanks.
Hello. Thanks for your talk.
Hi.
Yeah, just two-part question. First, are you in Connecticut?
Sure. Yes, I'm in Connecticut.
Okay. Okay, yeah, because the earlier part of your presentation reminded me of Mitch Green's view on like organic meaning. So I was wondering if you were like taking some inspiration from that. Kind of like the
Mitch Green's view.
Yes.
Yes, Mitch Green is in my department and
yeah, that's what
seminars with him.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Yeah, it sounded like at least a little bit similar. Okay, my more like substantial question was, okay, can you go back to your presentation?
Yes, I can share my PowerPoint again. Yes, sure. Which slide would you like?
Just like the maybe. Yes.
The one before this.
Let me see the one before. And maybe the last one, like the last one might work as well.
Oh, is it this one?
So wherever you're like the conclusion.
This one?
I think here.
Yeah, I didn't really have a conclusion. This was the last slide.
Okay. I don't know what I'm thinking of. In any case, okay, so yeah, I think this is really, really cool and informative as far as like explaining behavior of like infants and like non-human animals. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are, and just and apologies if I missed this in your presentation. I wonder what your thoughts are as far as like how we might use this, or if you think we do use this to explain just fully developed humans, right? So is the idea that maybe we've got more sophisticated types of theory of mind happening, but maybe we default to like minimal theory of mind kind of execution when there's like more demands, or like the situation doesn't really call for it or something like that. Yeah, just curious.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I have spent a lot of time thinking about that, and so my intuition is that it's not like this form of mind reading goes away. I think we do use it even when we're adults. So maybe in everyday tasks when we don't really have to, we're just engaging in social interactions, and we just have to like directly respond, and there isn't that much time to think about the mental states that other people are in. But I wouldn't say that that's what we're doing all of the time. So I do think that there are cases where we are engaging in, for example, deliberation about the mental states of others. So we're maybe doing, I don't know if we're doing the folk psychology kind of thing, but we are doing a more deliberate form of reasoning that's not, oh, see the mental state, respond to it kind of thing. And I'm even open to the fact that in those cases, we could be doing something like simulation or a lot of the other alternative forms of mind reading to the folk psychology that's out there in adult cases. I don't think we're I want to, it's a very humble thing. I think this is just one form of mind reading. So I don't think this is the form of mind reading that everybody uses at all times. Even infants, for example, might in other cases use simulation, for example, because there are lower forms of simulation that some researchers have proposed for infants and even certain non-human animals. So I think this is one form of mind reading. And to answer your first question, I do think that adults do this sometimes. So when we're engaging in social interactions, it's easier to we don't have to think about the mental states. When we recognize them, we can just respond to them, I think. Does that help?
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much. I'll step away now.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, of course.
Great, thanks so much, Elizabeth and Nimra. If there are other questions from the room for the time being, if not, let's move online. If there are questions online for Nimra. And if not, hang on a second. Let me, in point of fact, well, let me ask, Sean, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Let me just get my thing here. Oops. There we go. Yeah, so thank you very much. I mean, I agree with a lot of what you say. I think it's, yeah, it makes a lot of sense, especially of those implicit false belief tests. And I always like the Buttleman experiments because they actually involve interaction with,
Yeah. Yes.
with the experimenters and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the one question I have is, when you say that the child or the animal represents the mental state, and you talk about it in terms of belief, I guess what I'd like to know is what do you mean by belief then? So a standard view would be that belief is this kind of hidden mental state, but it sounds like you don't think that's what a belief is. So how would you characterize the notion of belief then?
Okay. So the idea, I guess I wasn't as clear about this. The mind reader would not be representing the mental state as a belief. Actually, they wouldn't be representing it as a propositional attitude. So they wouldn't be thinking, oh, the experimenter knows that the toy is in this box. They actually don't represent mental states as such. That's the idea. They represent them as affordances. So they have this practical knowledge of mental states that's limited to recognizing them and responding to them. And the way they represent them is, I think they have these mechanisms to detect the sensory patterns that they're receiving. So it's a very they just directly perceive them.
Okay.
And they don't but on the standard view, that's what's going on. I guess they're representing them as beliefs, as beliefs of others.
Right. Okay. Then I guess just to follow up is the notion of affordance. If you go back to Gibson and take up that notion,
yes,
it's typically posed as a kind of anti-representationalist view that
yes,
you can perceive affordances, you don't need a representation. But
yes, that's
you're
correct.
saying, and direct perception is usually characterized that way too. But you're saying somehow or other in there, these kind of minimal push-me-pull-you type representations are working. So why do you need them, or why would you consider them representations, I suppose?
Right. So, yeah, thank you. That's a really great question. So I'm not a Gibsonian on this. So I don't think that we don't have representation. So that's this is what I'm getting from the Millikan account. That's very important. So she does take on the kind of affordance framework that Gibson is providing, but then she takes it into the direction of representation. So she's very much that we do represent the world. Like there's internal where we represent it as and there's representations in our head. So it's when we interact with the world. So it's not an anti-representational account. I do think that there are representations, and when we interact with the world, we have those representations. I just think we don't need propositional attitudes to interact with other people or interact with the world. You can have these more primitive representations because PPRs are very much supposed to be more basic representations. They're non-conjunctive, so they don't require inference like a belief, using a belief in the world, or using a goal state. I'm in the middle there, I think.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question.
Great, thanks so much to both. And if I may just briefly interject a question of my own. This is not sophisticated, I promise.
Yes, of course.
So if you've got, you had a slide where you had behavior reading.
Yes, I Should I
And
put it back
mind
up?
reading,
Yes, sure.
no, you don't need to, it's fine. And then in between, there was
Okay.
this kind of minimal Tom thing, right? And so this is the
Yes.
kind of thing that asks for in-betweens, right?
Yes. Yes.
Presumably, I don't want you to take a stance and views on vagueness right now, but presumably you don't believe there's a sharp cutoff here.
No, so
either
yeah,
way.
that's my whole thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so how would you characterize differences between minimal Tom and Tom? And how would you characterize differences between minimal Tom and behavioral reading, such that this is perhaps an autonomous category to analyze what's going on? Or
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think that's that's a constant struggle when you're. So I don't believe that there's these sharp cutoffs when we're interacting with people. It's a continuum, and I think the continuum exists between non-human animals, between infants, and between us. So as I said with the last question, I don't think this form of mind reading just goes away when we become adults. So I think it's very much there. It's just I think what it might be is it's a situation dependent thing. We use it, or it might even just have different functions. So it might be that folk psychology does have a function in our social interactions. It's just not used most of the time. But there are certain situations where we use it. And I think the most tricky part is not even articulating the conceptual differences, because I could say that, okay, so the difference between behavior reading and the minimal mind reading is that these minimal mind readers do understand something about mental states. So they have this practical knowledge about mental states, and they can respond to them, and they're not only using behaviors to understand other people or associations between behaviors. The tricky part is how to do experiments with these things to see which one they're using at which time. And there is some there are some like the experimental paradigms you can use to tug apart behavior reading and mind reading, but then there's always objections. So it's like, yeah, but you could just be doing this other thing, and like you could be doing this low level thing. And I think that's just the constant struggle we're going to have with skeptics. There will always be someone. I think Cecilia Hayes does this a lot, where if you have an experiment that finally does something she said would be a control, there's always another explanation for it. This post hoc explanation. So I think there will be a lot of back and forth always between what is it that infants are doing in this case, or even adults are doing in any case. And I don't really have any smart way to deal with that other than saying we'll just have to keep trying to create certain boundaries and controls.
So quick question. So why you very nicely put it in terms of skepticism and so on. So why would one be skeptical about this? Why wouldn't there be a plurality of notions of mind such that with respect to each, one gets to count as mind reading at various levels of lack of sophistication, so to speak. And so why would this be a kind of skeptical, taking a step back rather than just delineating various concepts of mentation such that it gets richer and richer, so to speak?
I think some of us do that. So I can't speak for everyone, but some of us are totally fine. I'm fine with there being multiple approaches to saying that, okay, in this situation, maybe they are engaging in some low-level stimulation because it requires, like cases of empathy, for example, where you're just like you're trying to understand the situation that the other person is. And I think infants can do this as well. So I'm totally fine and on board with the plurality of approaches. I think I don't know where the skepticism comes from. So I think it's maybe this we think we're more special than not non-human animals, so we can do all sorts of things that they can't. That's just a speculation I have, but I'm not sure. Maybe you can tell me.
Far be it from me. Right. So this is absolutely terrific. Thanks so much, Nimra. And if there are other questions, comments,
Thank
or
you.
joiners,
Thank you.
And if not, please join me in thanking Nimra for her work.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate all your questions. Thank you.